In some forests, you can walk for miles and feel you're the only soul alive there. But there are other forests that feel inhabited, ancient, an existence that reaches far beyond our own with their own primordial hierarchy. The Russian Far East, Primorye, is the latter. This is Taiga country, vast, layered, and old in a way that's difficult to fully grasp. Oaks grow here with trunks 6 feet across, their bark folded and hardened by centuries. Korean pines rise even higher, taller, older, and more primitive than their European and American cousins, relics of a deeper, older world. In winter, the snow lies thick across everything, muting sound, preserving tracks and holding memory. Nothing moves without leaving a trace. And in this place, people have long understood that they are not alone. Here, the tiger is not always just a tiger. There is a word, Amba, and it can mean tiger, but it can also mean something else entirely. A powerful spiritual force that awaits and watches. Vladimir Markov was not an outsider to this world. He knew the forest. He knew how to survive it. But he was also a poacher. And not just any poacher. The kind who pushed further than most. This was December 1993 in the new Russia, where the biggest risks just might come with what had previously been unimagined rewards. But by the 1990s, the Amur tiger was a red book animal, protected, rare, and increasingly symbolic. Hunting one wasn't just illegal, it was crossing a line that was, for many, becoming cultural, even spiritual. Men who worked alongside Markov knew this. They might take deer, boar. One ranger even found Markov with a badger in his cooking pot. For these people, bending the rules when they could often came down to survival. But to hunt a tiger, that was different. Even among poachers, it wasn't something you did lightly. Most had neither the weaponry nor the guts for it. And yet, there were rumours. Markov had expressed interest before. He talked about the value, what a tiger could fetch on the black market across the Chinese border. In local slang, a tiger even had a nickname, Toyota, because that's what it was worth. The price of a good foreign car. Markov believed the tiger could bring in $50,000. Someone had put that number in his head. And at some point, whether through greed, pressure, or misjudgment, he stepped over that line. Not just the legal one, but the one people in the region had learned over generations not to cross. The first encounter itself is simple, at least on the surface. A tiger makes a kill, a wild boar. Markov comes across it with his dogs. The dogs run in. There is a confrontation. Shots are fired. And Markov leaves with meat that ultimately wasn't his. It's also possible Markov discovered the boar when the tiger wasn't present and simply took some of the meat. But whatever happened in that clearing, it didn't end there. And to understand what came next, it helps to understand the animal involved. As the tiger, a true story of vengeance and survival describes, unlike wolf or bear claws, a cat's claw is needle sharp at the end and bladed along a portion of its inside length, about as close to a surgical tool as one can find in nature. And those claws are not just for gripping. The book goes on to say, the forepaws can serve as twin maces, enabling a tiger to club its prey to death. This is an animal built with frightening precision. In Soviet zoological texts, the tiger is described as a huge physical force with quiet confidence, combined with a rather heavy grace. And then there is the full picture as put by John Vaillant. Picture the grotesquely muscled head of a pit bull and then imagine how it might look if the pit bull weighed 1/4 of a ton. Add to this fangs the length of a finger, backed by rows of slicing teeth capable of cutting through the heaviest bone. Consider then the claws, a hybrid of meat hook and stiletto that can attain 4 inches along the outer curve, a length comparable to the talons on a velociraptor. Now, imagine the vehicle for all of this. 9 feet or more from nose to tail, and 3.5 feet at the shoulder. Finally, emblazon this beast with a primordial calligraphy, black brushstrokes on a field of russet and cream. In other words, this is not just a predator. It is something close to a design perfected. And this animal, a mature male Amur tiger, came to Markov's cabin. Not immediately, not just to reclaim its stolen meat. It seemed to have a different purpose. It anticipated his return and lay down ready, patient. Time passed. Long enough for the snow beneath its body to melt. Long enough for the frozen ground to change. Long enough for the tiger to defecate, more than once, within a few feet of the cabin. And long enough that investigators would later conclude it had been there, perhaps for days. During its vigil, every now and then, it rose from its snowy post and seemingly vented its frustration at Markov's absence. Anything that carried Markov's scent was singled out. An axe handle chewed to splinters, a cooking pan crushed and mangled, the latrine shredded and destroyed. These were objects, not prey. Each bore scent, not flesh. It wasn't feeding. It wasn't hunting. It was doing something else. For a long time, behaviour like this would have been dismissed as coincidence. Instinct, a random overlap between predator and human. But that view is changing. We now understand that large predators, especially cats, are capable of far more than simple stimulus and response. They remember, they learn, they recognise individuals. They can associate events, locations, even consequences. There are recorded cases, rare but credible, of tigers returning to the sites of injury, of following the people who harmed them, of responding not immediately but later. So the question becomes unavoidable. What did this tiger know? There is a rumour, unsubstantiated, that Markov had done more than steal the tiger's meat. Those who knew Markov are tight-lipped about the events, but at least some have suggested that Markov may have injured or killed a pair of tiger cubs with a set of snares not necessarily intended for them. In fact, it was first assumed that Markov had been killed by an angry tigress, just defending her cubs. But the tracks confirmed that not only was the tiger a male, but it was also the biggest male in over 50 miles. The rangers nicknamed him the Tsar of the Forest, and he likely weighed close to 500 pounds. Either way, if Markov did snare cubs, it is not unreasonable to presume they may have been related to this male. He certainly had no rivals in the vicinity. We also know that presented with such a bounty, what we know of Markov suggests he wouldn't have turned it down. He had also admitted to dining on Taiga before, which wasn't unheard of in the region. So he could have simply seen them as much needed protein in the unrelenting Siberian winter. But he also knew the value of cubs, especially for the Chinese delicacy known as Taiga wine. Whatever had motivated Taiga to track Markov, when he returned to his cabin, the Taiga was still there waiting. The tracks in the snow told a straightforward story. Markov's tracks came in from the north and the entrance road that led towards the cabin and showed a walking pace. The tracks from the cabin were of the Taiga, and each of the Taiga's tracks were at least 10 feet apart. The Taiga had approached Markov in a furious sprint. At the point where the tracks met, Markov's prints seemed to disappear into thin air. The Tigers, though, slowed to a walking pace and turned towards the forest. Rangers who discovered the scene followed what quickly became a grisly trail. Circling, calling crows also told them the tiger was still in the area and guarding its kill. A few steps into the trees, they found a hind foot of one of Markov's dogs. A single glove was found a little further on. A torn, blood-stained jacket cuff was next. Then, about 100 yards in, they find a long white bone, likely a femur, gnawed to bloodless white. A few steps further, and the icy grasp of the snow, in temperatures as low as 30 below zero, had been melted away, revealing an armless hand and a faceless head. Markov had been decapitated. His struggle had not been prolonged. The force he had met had been decisive and overwhelming, the kind of violence only an apex predator can deliver. Markov was killed quickly. That, at least, we know. The rest of Markov's remains were found a little further on. Were it not for the gleaming shards of broken bone sticking up from the boots and the tattered shirt with an arm still in one of its sleeves, they could have been mistaken for a pile of macabre laundry. The rangers said that they had never seen a human so thoroughly and gruesomely annihilated. Vaillant, the author of the book, likens it to the scene of Grendel's den. We can't easily justify Markov's actions, but he was found wearing thin rubber boots, completely incapable of insulating him from the cold. This was a man living on the edge of extreme poverty. We should also consider that the last person to see Markov alive noticed he was acting on edge. When his comrade offered him a bunk for the night, Markov refused. The reason he gave was that it will kill the dogs. Perhaps we can infer that the tiger had been drawing near to Markov for some time. He certainly seemed aware of its presence. And, as was part of his culture, he had possibly begun to accept his fate. For Amba, the malevolent spirit of the forest, should you be unfortunate enough to attract its attention, will often manifest itself as a tiger. This is the belief of the Nunai, the Udage, and the Orchi. It's also surmised from the fact Markov was wearing a gun belt that he was armed at the time. His friends, who first discovered the scene, likely hid his gun from the authorities. And we now know that Markov did manage to wound Taiga in the leg. Its limping trail led eastwards, making the occasional stop to lick clean its wounds of blood and pus, which were left in the snow. It made its way to a workers' camp, one where Markov had been a regular visitor. The tiger seemed now highly sensitized to Markov's scent. Markov had last visited the camp to trade some boar meat for supplies. Perhaps the boar meat he'd taken from the tiger's kill. It is thought that the tiger likely picked up on the scent of both Markov and the boar meat, even in its ruined state, within an outhouse at the work camp. And we think this because after making a beeline to the camp and the outhouse, the tiger destroyed the workers' toilet and consumed its contents. While this behaviour is still now considered unprecedented, we can understand it in terms of territory. The tiger maybe recognised the contents as his. The behaviour certainly isn't explained by hunger, as the tiger had literally gorged on Markov and his dogs just 24 hours before. But maybe, just maybe, what the tiger smelled simply enraged him. What was happening in the Siberian wilderness was unknown to scientists, but its precedent was ancient. The Udagir believe in a type of Amba that they call the igu, an enormous fur-covered creature like a tiger that eats people. Andrei Prochepna had known Markov well, and the young 20-year-old considered him an uncle. Jobless and moneyless, it was during the official grieving period being held for Markov that Andrei took it upon himself to check some traps in the forest for mink and weasel. He was armed with an old Mosin carbine rifle, a rusty pre-war weapon that was little good for hunting. Crucially, it had now been a week since the tiger had killed and eaten Markov, and it was sporting a fresh injury, a laceration to its left paw pad, likely sustained when it had destroyed the outhouse at the work camp. In his other leg, a tightly grouped number of pea-sized buckshot, likely deposited by his victim's gun, had raked his right paw and foreleg, separating it at the joint. This could only have been done at point-blank range, and if Markov's homemade ammo had been factory load, it would have shattered the tiger's leg. Instead, it was now merely mechanically off. Its timing was affected, as it hadn't yet been able to adapt to its injuries. Time and again, it stalked its prey and set up skilled ambushes. We know this from tracks that were later found. Yet each time it missed. The tiger was not a man-eater in the traditional sense. Markov had been a special case. But now, circumstances had shifted. The tiger was starving and winded. Andrei arrived at an old hunting cabin around midday. He made a fire and ate some bread with hot tea. Although over a mile away, the tiger somehow sensed his presence. But by the time it found the cabin, Andrei had left. But the tiger had also learned that the men of the forest return. It just had to wait. And it chose to do so in comfort. It broke into the cabin and carried out an old mattress from inside. It then proceeded to carry the mattress 50 yards to a spruce tree and lay down on it, seemingly in plain sight. We know from that location that visibility was excellent in both directions. It was an unusual place for an ambush. A tiger weighing over 400 pounds, lying sphinx-like on a mattress, should have been hard to miss. Yet, from what we know of the scene, it seems Andre was not aware of the tiger until he was within 10 yards of it. It also seems, despite being a trained soldier and being ready, his gun failed him at the last second and did not fire. The tiger's hunger is indicated by the fact that there was very little left of Andre. Just a heap of blood-blackened clothing in a thawed-out circle of snow. It looks more like Andre had spontaneously combusted rather than being a victim of an animal attack. The remains were discovered by his father 3 days later, after he didn't return from his hunting trip. The tiger, who was already being tracked, was now tracked more relentlessly for over a week and eventually shot and killed by a group of rangers known as the Tigers. Leading them was a man called Yuri Trush. He was the one who stared down the tiger in its end moments. Caught unawares, he was rushed by the tiger, and in that moment Trush too had accepted his fate, even though he raised his rifle and was able to fire twice. Yet, it seemed in this time, fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to Trush, 2 of the men he was with had repositioned themselves and saw the tiger rush Trush. As it leapt, they were able to fire 11 times in the 3 seconds it took the tiger to make contact with Trush. It hit him in full flight and brought him to the ground. A minute later, when Trush came to and was brought to his feet, he couldn't understand why he was still alive. The tiger's momentum had somersaulted it behind Trush, but it should have hit him head on, literally. The tiger was in its death throes, and a control shot was still needed to end its 9th life permanently. And it was only then that Trush's rifle was discovered, embedded in the tiger's throat up to the buttstock. His gun had saved his life after all, but not in the way intended. Fate, it would seem, had a sense of humour. The investigation that followed to this date is still one of the most detailed studies of human-tiger conflict ever recorded. But the questions it raised have never fully gone away. And now, decades later, the story has taken on another layer. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, international conservation funding for the Amur tiger has been severely disrupted. Organisations like Phoenix, once central to anti-poaching efforts, have been dismantled or absorbed. Some of the men who once protected these animals have been pulled into an entirely different conflict. And the fate of the Amur tiger today is uncertain. In our absence, it may be struggling, or it may be surviving, perhaps even recovering. We don't really know. So where does that leave the story? A poacher who crossed a line, legal, cultural, perhaps something deeper. A tiger that seemingly became obsessed with reclaiming its territory from a man it considered an interloper. And if this was indeed revenge, it may be the closest thing to it we have ever documented in a wild animal. And if it wasn't, then we are left with something perhaps more unsettling. A predator that behaves in ways we recognise. For reasons we still don't fully understand. But as we've discovered, in the forests of the Russian Far East, they already have a word for something like that. They call it the Amba. Thank you as always for joining me and listening. I'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.